The IDF has received the instructions from the government to push Hezbollah back, to take extensive action against Hezbollah's capabilities in order to restore safety and security to the people of Israel. For almost a year now, 60,000 Israelis have been evacuated from their homes along the border of Lebanon, and it's high time that they get back home. We've tried over the last year through courses of negotiations in order to create, with the American assistance, the opportunity for them to come home. But unfortunately, that has not delivered up until now. The government, we are following the instructions. From our perspective, we are conducting our strikes against Hezbollah, against their leadership, against their commanders in the field, against their tools of terror that they have built over the last 20 years. And they have accumulated, Joe, the most extensive rocket and missile and drone capability, and I would say more and larger than most Western nations. So from our perspective, the situation that has been ongoing now for a year is unacceptable. The IDF is charged to change that situation. Of course, if the government instructs us to hold our fire, that's what we will do.
Is it the case that the Prime Minister had given his assent to a truce but then backed away? Because that's what's being reported.
So I don't know about that. Obviously, that is not within the purview of the IDF. We are busy doing the war fighting. The diplomats need to do the diplomacy.
OK, so Israel argues it's targeting Hezbollah weaponry and facilities, as you just outlined, in Lebanon. But women and children are dying, more than 150, according to Lebanese officials. How can you justify that?
Joe, we are doing extensive operations against how and where Hezbollah has positioned its locations. We've distributed extensively materials, footage showing exactly how Hezbollah has built, in the locations that they've built, their weapons capabilities in houses, in the attic of a building, precisely to put people in harm's way. What we have done over the last almost week now is called on extensive evacuation of those locations that we are going to strike, precisely because they are not safe. You can't expect us not to target a cruise missile that's been pre-positioned intentionally, and I would say in stark contravention with international humanitarian law and the laws of armed conflict in these civilian locations.
Yeah, but we're hearing stories of civilians who are in houses who had nothing to do with Hamas that have been hit.
I would say that this, contrary to the failures of October 7th, this war is the war that Israel and the IDF have actually been planning for. The extent of our intelligence information, and just by the amount of footage that we're distributing on the strikes that we're conducting, shows that we have a very strong grasp of what's going on. I would say we're going to extensive steps in order to limit civilian casualties. The activity of calling people to evacuate, broadcasting it, distributing it on media, on social media, is effective. We've seen the traffic jams coming out of southern Lebanon. And of course, it is a huge challenge. We're committed to limiting civilian casualties on one hand, but on the other hand, taking out where Hezbollah have positioned those capabilities.
But how can you say it's been effective when we're seeing women and children die? We've spoken to people who've spoken to people getting out of there and spoken of the trauma of their houses being blown apart and not having time to get away.
Yeah, well, you're talking to me and asking me about why should they be evacuated. And just by looking at the video that you're showing now, this is a precision strike. Look how accurate it is just in the specific room where the terrorists were planning their attacks. This is the situation that we're currently facing. So I would say, don't take it up with Israel why we are conducting the strikes against their weapons and tools of terror that Hezbollah has accumulated as the most significant terrorist army in the world. Take it up with Hezbollah. They need to evacuate. They shouldn't have even been in these areas in southern Lebanon. According to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 from 2006, that stipulates explicitly that no weapons of Hezbollah should be south of the Litani. So we are now in a year after 60,000 Israelis have been evacuated from their homes, and we are determined to change that, to bring them home. It can be done through negotiations, and I think when the announcement this morning of the Prime Minister saying that we will be looking into the conditions, but we can't allow the situation to continue as it has been for the last year. Would you be willing to be evacuated for a year because a terrorist organization is threatening your home?
So senior Israeli military figures are talking about a possible ground offensive. How soon could that begin? Israeli troops inside Lebanon?
So the IDF is indeed preparing its forces. We have, and the IDF Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, said earlier this week, speaking to the forces, to the reservists that have been called up, that we will be making the plans to mobilize if required, if need be, and if instructed by the government. Those instructions have not yet been given, but we need to be prepared for that situation. I know the understanding that Hezbollah is not going to stop firing rockets and stop attacking or stop trying to conduct the types of attacks of October 7th. We have a very short memory, but in the first month of this war, in October and November, there were 7 attempts by Hezbollah to conduct October 7th type attacks. So we are very concerned. Obviously, the people that lived there are even more concerned about them being able to go home.
So in order to prevent those kind of attacks, would the goal be to establish some kind of buffer zone, a no man's land into Lebanese territory?
There's a lot of talk of that option. I think that's not what we are talking about currently. We are currently in an aerial operation, taking out those capabilities, the tools, the rockets, the missiles, the drones. This week in Tel Aviv, we've had for the first time, Hezbollah had launched a rocket towards Tel Aviv, a cruise missile, surface-to-surface guided missile towards Tel Aviv. That's a reality we can't accept, and we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again. The terms and conditions can be dictated through military force, and indeed there is a possibility that there will need to be a ground mobilization, and or through diplomacy. Those two things are on the table, and we need to exhaust both.
So would a buffer zone, some kind of buffer zone be essential to ensure that those kind of attacks don't happen again?
That's a lot of ifs in one question, but I would say the reality is it may be necessary, but it may not be, because if there's a negotiated agreement, a diplomatic route out of this, then we can avert that perhaps. Of course, from the military's perspective, we need to lay on the table for the government to decide what is the best solution, best option for the government to decide on, and they will make their decisions.
How severely do you believe Hezbollah has been degraded with your recent attacks?
So they have accumulated, some estimates say, up to around 200,000 rockets and missiles and drones. And so we are obviously not in a situation where that is something that can be destroyed overnight. And if we look at what's happened over the last week, we've targeted the senior commanders, the senior leadership, the tactical and operational commanders in the field, and the capabilities. So I would say there's still a long way to go before we can say that this is over, but we have to get it over in a way where Hezbollah do not pose such a threat ever again.
What about the likelihood of Iran stepping in with expanded support, especially if you do go in with a ground offensive? This is what the world wants to avoid. What more trauma could that bring on the Israeli people?
Well, what more trauma is the question, and I think that Iran is a substantial threat. Iran also has a lot to lose in joining in this war. I think that there is a very significant reality that we need to try and avert. We can do that, as I said, through military force or through negotiations. And I would say, yeah, Iran has to be very, very wary of joining in. We will defend the people of Israel. We will defend Israelis. Israelis also have the right to live in safety and security. And it is these bad players in the region, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis in Yemen, that fired this morning towards Israel, towards Tel Aviv overnight, that are disrupting the safety and security. We need to restore safety and security to the region, and Israelis also need and have the right to live in that safety and security. Yeah,
you say you can do that with military force, but in this joint statement by your strong allies, they said when they were calling for this ceasefire, They were saying there's an unacceptable risk of a broader regional escalation. This is in nobody's interest, neither the people of Israel nor the people of Lebanon. Do you accept that?
I would say that the negotiations that have been ongoing for the last year have not resulted in the outcome that needs to be reached. You know,
but there was this truce proposed last night.
It's a 21-day hiatus that possibly could give Hezbollah the chance to regroup. So do you cede that on what notion? That will the people be able to go home? I think there's a very, very big question mark. Of course, I don't want to overstep my responsibility as a military spokesperson. The government needs to dictate what its terms, if those terms seem feasible to them in the negotiations, together with our allies, with the US and France and everybody else that has joined, including Australia, to that call of a ceasefire. But the ceasefire needs to dictate, there needs to be a very clear outcome that Israelis will be able to go home.